If I ask my heart and conscience, the incentive behind building a tower, I have to admit it was just pure megalomania. All creative people work from their subconscious outwards. I'm not an intellectual at all. In fact, most intellectuals resent me. They all realize I'm not one of them, and it's quite nasty. To them, I'm sort of an overgrown child. And I always try, and now that I'm old, saying I'm in my second childhood, you must excuse me. But of course, that's not strictly true, because I've never grown out of my first childhood.
His godfather was Edward VII, King of England, a frequent guest at West Dean for the weekend hunting parties. It was rumored that the king was young Edward's real father, a story that Edward typically refuted with a story of his own.
You see, the king was constantly here, and naturally gossip went around that he was my mother's lover. Well, I know that is completely untrue. The king knew that my mother was his daughter, and therefore, where any bastard blood came in, it wasn't in that generation, it was in my grandmother's generation. I think if the truth had been told and been admitted that she was the daughter of Edward VII and not the mistress, it would have been made much more sense, much more wholesome. I remember being brought down ceremoniously to say goodnight to her. She wasn't like an ordinary mother who put you to bed or fed you or things. My nurse was my real mother. My nurse was warm and comfy and soft, and my mother had very, very tight whalebone corsets, looked very beautiful, was covered with jewels, it seemed all the time. She had things on top of things, which was the Edwardian fashion. She would have sables with double Parma violets pinned on them, and the sables had horrid little heads that showed they'd once been live animals. My mother was so distant from my children. There's a story about her which is probably apocryphal, but it sums up the attitude. She was heard calling up the main staircase one day, "Nanny, Nanny, I want one of the children to take to church." And my nurse replied, "Which one, madam?" She said, "The one that goes best with my blue dress." If I'm a surrealist, it's not because I got linked with a movement, it's because I was born one. A great number of people are surrealists without ever having heard of the movement. But it is people who were close to their subconscious. The world is not completely logical all the time. They make the illogical logical, and they make it more vivid than life, in the way that dreams can sometimes be more vivid than actuality. When I was a child, I used to have the most extraordinary surrealist fantasies. I think one of the reasons that my fantasy was developed so intensely was that I was forced to rest, quite unnecessary, when I should have been allowed to run around in the garden. I was made to sleep in my perambulator, and I couldn't sleep. Also, I wasn't allowed up in the morning. I remember in Scotland on a wonderful fine day in August, and the sun pouring through the blinds at 7. I wanted to get out of my little bed, which I was hemmed in by big brass rails, and run out into the garden and down to the beach, but I wasn't allowed to until Nanny woke up, which wasn't until 8:30. So I would have from 7 till 8:30, in which I'd have to invent a world, and therefore all my blankets became a flying city, and I made domes out of the pillows, and I would get under and imagine that I was in a series of halls, and this was Aladdin's palace flying over the world.
Edward was obsessed with Tilly Lush, and he said that on their marriage night, he naturally wanted to consummate their marriage. And she quite laughed at him and said, "I mean, you don't think that I married you to have this kind of a relationship with you, do you? I mean, you couldn't have been thinking that." And she refused to have a sexual relationship with him.
I remember Lady Cunard saying to me when I was 16 at a tea party, she asked me some question, "Where is so-and-so?" So I told her where so-and-so was and how he was, and evidently I should have answered the question truthfully. So she said to me, she had a very funny voice, Lady Cunard, she talked like this, she said, "Edward, the trouble about you is you will go around telling the truth. Now, society is built upon a lie, And if you go around telling the truth the way you do, you won't be received in decent houses. Which I thought very profound.
Ostracized by his social set after his divorce, Edward retreated to his childhood home at West Dean.
I was very broken with grief after my wife left me, and also the exhaustion of the ballet, and a great loss of money too. So I came back to this house alone, and the spring was so glorious at West Dean. This house was so full of treasures. The whole place was so rich with everything beautiful in creation that as I was beginning my dinner, I suddenly saw the room begin to spin. I looked up at the ceiling and I knew it was a projection of my own subconscious, but I saw a circle of all creation with a great light in the middle, and all the flowers and trees according to their genuses spread out, and all the animals according to their races and families, all round this central light. And then it began to turn slowly and then faster and faster, and I heard the music of the last movement of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony going faster and faster and faster till suddenly it exploded in the sky.
Edward turned his rejection by proper society into a source of inspiration. He outraged his fox-hunting neighbors by converting his father's hunting lodge, known as Moncton, into a whimsical, surrealist showcase. Traditionalists were shocked by the lavender exteriors, fiberglass palm trees, mock bamboo drain pipes, plaster sheets permanently drying in the windows, and a chimney clock that counted the days of the week. Completed in 1937, Moncton was a seedbed for ideas that Edward would later realize at Las Posas. Edward even had the paw prints of his beloved wolfhounds woven into the carpet, a motif he had used at West Dean with Tilly's footprints, and would later repeat at Las Posas in concrete. Moncton became a home for the surrealist art Edward was now beginning to collect in earnest, which included a couch inspired by a Dali painting in the shape of Mae West's lips.
I always thought Edward was barking mad, and that was due to the peculiar things he was always doing. Inviting Dali to come and live with him, for example.
He had an obsession about tissue paper. He traveled with 5,000 layers or rolls or packages of tissue paper.
I thought he was quite simply crazy at the beginning. But it wasn't that way at all. He was not crazy. He was indeed eccentric. He did have certain hang-ups and things he did. I began to notice early on that he had to go into the bathroom a lot, and what he did was he washed his hands a lot. He was constantly washing his hands, and I counted up one day, I think it got to be 28 times in the late morning and early afternoon.
I've never wanted to be an eccentric. In fact, I've tried to conform as much as possible, but something in my nature obliges me to be eccentric, and people think, oh, he's posing. He wants to make himself interesting. He's posing as eccentric. It's quite untrue. One is an eccentric, in this case, entirely against one's own will, one's own planning. It's just something that was born with, like having green hair. In fact, there was, I think, a movie called The Boy with the Green Hair, showing that he couldn't help having green hair.
I met Edward, and Nellie introduced me to him. And of course, he was very interested. I asked him, I'd like to work for you. He said, well, you had to come to me and we're going to talk, discuss all what I want from you. So I said, fine. So next day I went to him and went to dinner. And he said, I like this thing. The first thing I hate, my secretary who want to work for me had to be on the nude. Do you mind? This is my first condition. If you mind, then I don't think so we can get along very well if you don't want to wear in the nude. So I said, well, it's okay. Being in Mexico, going in the river, I take my clothes off and I swim, so what difference it makes to me? We start type, repeat them many times. And then, if I was typing a lot of paper and something fall on the floor, we had to throw it away because it was germs. I don't want anything to fall on the floor. Everything is dirty, so let's try to destroy this thing. Let's burn it on the toilet. So you go to the toilet and burn every paper on the toilet. And they say, and give me more paper. Now start all over again. Maybe one poem will start maybe 20 times, typing over and over and over.
As a surrealist, Edward felt that art should compete with reality. His first glimpse of the Watts Towers in Los Angeles moved him deeply. Here was a magnificent surrealist creation on a scale beyond anything he had imagined, and the city was threatening to destroy it. The Watts Towers are the work of an Italian-American craftsman named Simon Rodia. He pieced them together out of concrete in bits of scavenged glass and tile. It took him 30 years. But Rodia had neglected to secure the proper building permits, and city officials condemned the towers as unsafe and irrational. Edward joined the rescue effort that saved them from the wrecking ball. For Edward, the Watts Towers were a revelation, something so big and so grand that it literally transformed reality. He saw a new way of realizing his own artistic ambitions.
I wanted a Garden of Eden set up where everything grew. I saw that Mexico was far more romantic and far more room than there is in crowded Southern California. So I bought 2 sleeping bags and I traveled around the country. Plutarco came along with me. And we used to sleep in the sleeping bags wherever we saw a turning that looked interesting. We saw that Hitler was a very beautiful place, and there wasn't anything as picturesque as Hitler.
Plutarco Gastelum was the manager of a telegraph office in Cuernavaca. He and Edward had heard about a hidden valley where orchids grew wild. They came upon the waterfalls and pools of Las Posas in the jungle near the village of Xilitla.
Well, I do remember that he took, I think it was 3 or 4 boa constrictors to the Hotel Francis in Mexico. And then he told me that he thought they were hungry.
I found that I had to bring back some boa constrictors, and I got them up to my room, and they wouldn't eat. And so I got an extra suite that opened into mine just for the boa constrictors, but they still wouldn't eat. And then a very nice friend of mine went all the way to the market and got a lot of nice mice from Lagunia in a sack, which looked very appetizing because I was told the boa constrictors would only eat live things. Meanwhile, Leonora got me 2 beautiful rats from a laboratory. They'd all been combed and washed to look their best because the laboratory thought she wanted to draw them. Well, the mice and the rats didn't like each other at all. And the boa constrictors wouldn't eat either. And the mice got out and ran along the corridor. And I don't know how, somebody must have left the door open. And one American lady, she was a Texan tourist, said, "My, there are mice in this hotel. This is disgusting. What the hell's happened in a hotel like this has mice?" And so the recamarera, the maid, said, "Oh no, senora, they're not the hotel's mice. They're the food for the 3 boa constrictors in the next room to you." I always wanted it a place to conserve wildlife, I'd like every conceivable animal. I'd like to be like Noah with the ark, if I could. My critics, or people who don't like me, say I like animals because they can't talk back at me. No? The first years I was solely interested in horticulture, and then suddenly in '62 there was a snowfall. Nobody had seen snow before, they didn't know what it was. So when I got back from New York a month later, they said, "Oh, Don Eduardo, for 3 days white ashes fell and burned everything." So then I decided I would do something that couldn't be killed by freak weather. So I began building only then, things that looked like trees and plants and flowers. That was the result of the snow. I know nothing about engineering, so I have to use twice the amount of reinforcing steel than necessary in order to be sure they will stand up. In fact, I didn't know I had the capability of being an architect. I do rather clumsy sketches. I used to do rather more careful sketches. The great thing is having found Don Jose. I do it a bit at a time. I say the next stage is we do this.
Undaunted by the cost and scale of his vision, Edward pursued the transformation of Las Posas, a project that eventually encompassed 36 concrete structures spread out over 80 acres of jungle. Las Posas took 40 workmen 25 years to build at a cost that exceeded $5 million. Having given away his principal asset, Edward's only source of funding for the continuing construction at Las Posas was the sale of the paintings he had acquired since the 1920s. By the time of the sale, he had amassed the largest personal collection of surrealist art in the world.
I just happen to know a lot of young, talented painters who, most of them were broke, because young artists, when they begin, have no following. They need money very much. So I began just buying paintings from them so as they could make a living and so they could continue their careers. I never bought pictures from indifferent or bad artists, at least none that I thought were bad, just to help them, because I don't think a bad artist should be encouraged. But there were real people of talent, like Cherichev, who really didn't know at the time where his next meal was coming, and I bought pictures from him, and Dali, who was doing all right, but he was not known. I went to his house in Spain and bought pictures from him when he was comparatively unknown. And Magritte was very poor at the time I first met him too. He came and stayed with me in London all one summer. Because I don't think a bad artist should be encouraged. But there were real people of talent, like Cherichev, who really didn't know at the time where his next meal was coming, and I bought pictures from him, and Dali, who was doing all right, but he was not known. I went to his house in Spain and bought pictures from him when he was comparatively unknown. And Magritte was very poor at the time I first met him too. He came and stayed with me in London all one summer. I only bought a few Picassos because Picasso was already established and he didn't need financial help. But I became a great friend of his. But I had no intention of making a collection. And I started being very surprised when I heard about the Edward James collection. I said, "What, am I a collector? I didn't know that."
The sale brought Edward enough money to sustain his extravagant lifestyle and continue the work at Las Posas.
Of course, at that period, he would talk about Hitler a lot. And the thing I regret most is that I didn't really take it very seriously. In a way, he didn't present it very seriously either. He would talk about doing these concrete things in the jungle, and talk about the jungle creeping up on it and the probability that it would not last. The other thing that one must remember is that it was a very remarkable combination of two people, Plutarco and Edward. Plutarcho, the practical man, a marvelous stage manager behind the man who had sufficient money to do this extraordinary thing, and the imagination and the creative zeal to carry it out.
I used to think that the time with Uncle Edward was as a tale, as a fairy tale. And he was our personal Santa Claus, who always came to take us to some wonderful places. That's the way I remember Uncle Edward, as our magical uncle.
The shapes here, of course, are taken from the nature of the forest. They're sort of instinctively flower shapes and leaf shapes above all, which are inspired by everything round here. But of course, nothing is finished, so some of them look very odd. For instance, Plutarcho calls those things helicopters, but they're going to actually turn into capitals. When it is 7 stories high, so now only 3 stories high, it's not even half what it's going to be. There's going to be a huge aviary on top with trees in it. That's why this is so terribly massive, because it's full of reinforced concrete, to stand live trees inside so the birds will really feel they're out of doors. Then we'll get all the wild parrots, and when they've bred enough, we'll let them out to multiply in the hills again. And there will be a room for projections and concerts. The principal thing will the tower will be an apiary with a many-sided object, dodecahedron, you know, the 12-sided object, which is in Leonardo's books on architecture. It'll go very slowly round like this, showing a different light. That'll be the top of all. That'll be the 8th floor. I mean, a lot would probably never be finished. I'd have to be 100 years old to finish them all. But then there's an Arabic proverb, somebody once told me, it's never finish to build thy house, which means always keep on adding something. Some Arab sage thought of that. I felt I can't be too dotty.